Good afternoon, Super Talk Mississippi. You are tuned into your radio happy hour. That's the good things. I'm your host, Rebecca Turner. We've got Rhino, who's joining us in studio today, and it is almost fall, y'all. I even heard that we may get some cooler weather coming up in the next week or so here in Mississippi. So that makes it the perfect season to social distance in the great outdoors. So go to visitmississippi.org to learn more. Now, September is National Recovery Month, and I believe recovery is a good thing to celebrate. So today, you'll hear from Ted Jackson. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist and author of You Ought to Do a Story About Me, Addiction, An Unlikely Friendship, and the Endless Quest for Redemption. So welcome, Ted.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me.
Well, it's good to have you here because I've been reading through everything that was sent over about the book. I will say I haven't read it yet, but it is one of the first books that I feel very drawn to actually sit down and read from cover to cover, because your book is all about the life of Jackie Wallace. Now, to some listening to Good Things, Jackie Wallace sounds pretty familiar. So, Ted, how would an avid football player know his name?
Well, honestly, when I met Jackie in 1990, I didn't recognize his name myself, and I didn't follow rosters. But anybody that followed football back in the 70s and through the early 80s would remember his name especially with the Vikings and then with the Colts and then with the Los Angeles Rams. He was a cornerback and still holds records for his punt returns and was a phenomenal defensive back, especially against Terry Bradshaw, who was always his nemesis. You can find the Super Bowl, and Super Bowl IX is a phenomenal NFL Films clip of Jackie's first half in that game. It was phenomenal.
So Jackie obviously wasn't at the top of his career, Ted, when you met him in 1990. Can you describe that day for us?
Well, that's what's crazy. That's where the book starts, and that's where really the title of the book comes from. I walked up on a homeless man sleeping under a bridge, and I shot his picture just because of the way his camp looked. It was very neat and very unusual in its arrangement. And then I woke him up to ask him a question about the story that I was really working on, which was another homeless camp. And he asked me why I wanted to know, and I told him I was with the Times-Picayune photojournalist, and he said, he kind of fumbled with the newspaper that was laying at his side at that point, and then he said, "You ought to do a story about me." And I said, "Why would I want to do that?" And he said, "Because I've played in 3 Super Bowls." Well, as a journalist, you hear that request all the time. "Hey, mister, shoot my picture, put me in the paper," all that kind of thing. And when Jackie said that, he had my attention from that word.
And you believed him, which I think is cool in and of itself. So many of us during this time would have just passed people off, and maybe you were joking, but you really dove into it, and you developed this uncanny friendship with Jackie Wallace. So if you met him back in 1990 and his story obviously sparked an interest with you, why did it take 30 years to translate that into your book, Ted?
Well, 30 years is a long time, and for this story, it took 30 years for this story to develop. Now, this isn't the first time I've written about Jackie, and it's not the first time stories have been written about his addiction and his recovery. When that happened in 1990, the picture I shot there was on the front page of the paper in 3 days, and the story motivated his old friends from St. Aug High School to whisk him off the street, get him into a rehab clinic in Baltimore. And so that had a phenomenal effect. And then years later, when I discovered that he had fallen off the wagon and had disappeared again, to my imagination, he was back on the streets and maybe even dead. It took years later for that to just continue to haunt me. And so when I finally made up my mind that I needed to find my old friend again and see what had happened to him and maybe I could help him, that's when the story started taking off, because it became a story about friendship, Jackie's struggle with his addictions, and how he continued to climb himself back into the land of the living. And when I found him again at that time, it became a worldwide sensation. Seriously, the story that I wrote at that time in the paper was the most read story ever written in the Times-Picayune, which shocked everybody.
Well, I think so much of it, at least a little bit I'm learning about Jackie Wallace's story, which, Ted, you write in the book, "You Ought to Do a Story About Me" is the title. That were the words from Jackie when you came across him in 1990. His story just is such a metaphor for so many others in our history or for our own lives. So what did you learn, Ted, that we all can learn about American history or just history in general from Jackie's story?
Well, it's amazing the things that we learned from this book. It's just so many things that go through Jackie's life, and he goes ups and downs and lefts and rights, and it's just people who have read it, they just tell me, I just never dreamed there was so much I could learn. And we talk about a lot about civil rights, Hurricane Katrina, slavery, public works, the NFL, CTE, Christianity, the Nation of Islam, redemption. And it goes through all these things and things that we didn't know we needed to know, I guess is one way to put it. But one thing I like to point out, because this is what hit me, is that you learn that life is messy, and you learn that we all struggle with issues. And for the most part, when we look at history, when we look at our society, we like to put people in boxes. And we like to think that we know everything about someone because we know one thing about someone. It's almost like finding out that your great-grandmother was a seamstress and thinking, well, that was my grandmother. Well, how many things other can you learn about someone than just their occupation? And Jackie is a treasure trove of American history and our human condition.
Well, you bring up such a good point, Ted, because I think that's one thing that makes his story at least intriguing to begin with the startup. I played in, I think you mentioned 3 Super Bowls. He was an NFL, superstar in so many people's minds. He would have had it all: a going career, his athletics, his health, and it just took the perfect storm for Jackie Wallace to find himself, in the midst of an addiction. So, without giving up, too much of the book, what are some of the key points in his life that took him in a completely different direction where he found himself addicted?
Well, Jackie grew up in New Orleans, and part of the New Orleans culture is learning to drink young. And he did, but that was never a problem for him. He really didn't like alcohol that much. And so he was never had a problem with addiction. That as we describe it. But when he had gotten out of football at 29 years old and had gotten another job, he was working in the oil field and making much more money than he was in the NFL. His mother died. And, the curiosity behind that is that Jackie absolutely adored his mother. She was the umbrella that held his life together. And when that happened, he felt like he had lost his unconditional love in life, that she was the one that gave him that. And that was the night of her funeral, is the night that he tried crack cocaine for the first time. And it's absolutely stunning in the book that you realize that one time absolutely ruined his life. And from then on, he was constantly trying to, claw his way back from that.
Which is the story of so many people who are living in active addiction. And here on Good Things, Ted, we try to celebrate recovery every chance we get, because this is so many people's stories now, like cancer or, heart disease, or even how we can talk about COVID too. Everybody knows someone in their family, or maybe them of themselves, have struggled with some form of addiction. And so the more we can share and humanize the fact that people make mistakes that have exponential consequences, yes, but then they can also come back, because a big piece of your book, too, You Ought to Do a Story About Me, is rehabilitation and redemption. So Ted Jackson, the author of You Ought to Do a Story About Me, is going to stick with us here on Good Things. We're going to dive a little bit more into Jackie's story as well as Ted's, because he's got a connection to Mississippi you'll want to know. So more. We're continuing our conversation here on Good Things with Ted Jackson. He's the author of You Ought to Do a Story About Me, Addiction, An Unlikely Friendship, and the Endless Quest for Redemption. It is based on the life of Jackie Wallace, who played in 3 Super Bowls, but found himself in the cycle of addiction and recovery. So, Ted, we were sort of left off on that part of addiction, but what can we learn in the book about rehabilitation and recovery and second chances?
Well, I might shock some people with this little, the beginning here is that I was speaking to a chaplain trying to learn what addiction was like. Told him, if I have to write about this, I need to know what it feels like to be addicted, because I've never been addicted to anything. And he looked me square in the eye and he said, "Oh, really?" He said, "You need to go look in your closet if you don't think you're addicted to anything." And I found that startling. And when I thought about it more, I thought about my sugar addiction. I love Cokes. I love chocolate. I can't stay off my cell phone more than 5 minutes.
Guilty.
And social media, just gets me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I suddenly realized that I suddenly had a connection with Jackie on that level. That Jackie, his addictions put him in the gutter and under bridges at night. And mine are pretty much celebrated in advertising and in society at large. So I suddenly realized how hard this was for Jackie to say if he stayed sober for 7 years at one time, how he had to fight those struggles every minute of every day for that long. And I have trouble putting my cell phone down for 5 minutes. So, that was a real eye-opener for me. But I also learned that an addiction, when you help someone in an addiction, that when you succeed, that you can never ride off into the sunset with victory. That addiction is a day-by-day thing, a minute-by-minute thing. And when someone does crash and burn in their addictions, just like someone trying to be on a diet who suddenly has a weak moment and eats a piece of chocolate cake, you don't label them in a box as an addict and then write their lives off as being worthless. There's redemption there by simply starting over the next day. And that's what I've learned with Jackie, that he craves the love that he lost when his mom died. And he craves the support that he gets in his fight to claw his way back every time he fails.
You open up such an opportunity for us to have more compassion, Ted, for those who are struggling in active addiction, or even those who have, been in recovery for so long. Someone on our text line who would prefer to name nameless, so I'm going to keep it that way, said they will be 21 years in recovery in November, and they use that terminology, in recovery, because it never really ends if you've been through something like that. And I think that's a cool sort of perspective for us to all take, is that no matter where we are, what we're doing, we all have a pull or addiction to something. It's just we may be more fortunate that ours doesn't, like you mentioned, Ted, wind us up in gutters or cause us to lose everything. So the book is about Jackie Wallace. There has to be a happy ending, and I certainly don't want to give away the book, but can you give us an update on Jackie? I know so many people are probably curious where he is today.
Well, I will say this to begin with, that whereas it seems like it's just a story about Jackie Wallace, when you get into it, you will realize that it's more about the relationship between me and Jackie. That's where it turns, because it's a story. It's not a biography. It's a biography and a memoir, because I wanted to go through the journey with Jackie and to talk about the things that I learned and how Jackie changed me. And it's a remarkable lesson when you really stop to think about it. That I stopped to take a picture of a poor homeless man, and he changed my life. And so it goes back and forth. But Jackie has made a remarkable difference in every life that he's come across. He has that personality that makes you just want to love him. And Jackie is doing well these days. I saw him 2 days ago. His smile is bigger than ever. His eyes are bright, and he's just a wonderful human being that I enjoy spending time with. And he struggles now mostly with his NFL hips and knees. Most people don't realize how hard that sport is on the body. And, of course, the residual effects of drug addiction, still bring his body down. So,
well, Ted, if we want to read the book, you ought to do a story about me. Where can we get a copy?
Well, I'll start by saying you can get them anywhere books are sold. That means online, national retailers, wherever. But I highly recommend the local independent stores are just awesome. Octavia Books in New Orleans is hosting my signed copies. If you order through them, I can sign those for you and send them out. We're having a book signing in Summit, Mississippi next Saturday night. And Gulf South Art Gallery in Summit is handling our book sales. And so those will be signed too. And the local stores in Mississippi and Jackson will surely have them also. So any place books are sold, it's just a wonderful opportunity to tell Jackie's story and the story of redemption.
So, Ted, I'm glad you brought up Mississippi because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you lived or have a connection to Mississippi once upon a time. What's that story?
Well, my connection is that I'm a Mississippian.
I thought so, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you worked here or if you lived here.
No, I grew up in Macomb, Summit, Boca Chica, and Brookhaven. That's where my people were and are. And my biggest regret in my career is that I never got to work as a journalist in Mississippi. I went to school at Southern Miss.
To the top.
Yes, right. And my first job was in New Iberia, and then I got an opportunity to join the Times-Picayune. And whenever there was a story in Mississippi on the assignments log, I begged for it because there's just something different. You knock on a door and people invite you in. This hospitality is not just a slogan. I just loved coming to Mississippi for stories.
And we probably saw several of your stories throughout the headlines 15 years ago with Hurricane Katrina. That's when you actually won your Pulitzer Prize for photojournalism during that time, Ted. So it seems you kind of thrive in these crisis coverage topics. Is that on purpose? Do you just get drawn to them? How do you find yourself always dealing with something not the best?
Well, I'm drawn to them. That's absolutely true. I have a heart for people that are in a crisis mode. I think that it comes from an old a sermon I heard when I was a kid about the parable of the talents and how it's so important when you can recognize your talent that you use them for God. And so I was never interested in the pretty pictures. I was interested in pictures that told stories of humans in trying to deal with their lives. And so I prepared for that. I learned how to negotiate those hard streets. And I felt like I could feel for them. And so that was a huge thing. I learned to navigate the housing projects in really bad situations. And when Hurricane Katrina came along, I was prepared for it because of everything that else I had done at that point. But the truth was, in Katrina, it was shooting pictures in self-defense is the way I try to describe it. I shot pictures because that was my skill. That's what I could do to help. And so when there was someone begging for rescue, if I could rescue them, that was great. If I couldn't, if it needed something more powerful than me, that picture called attention to it. And it was remarkable to see those kind of things unfold. Take a picture and suddenly, the military shows up the next day to help the 30,000 people at the convention center. Katrina was something that changed all of us that were here at the time.
Undoubtedly, absolutely. It still haunts so many of us 15 years later. One last question for you, Ted. When's the very first time you picked up a camera?
Well, my mother let me touch the Polaroid camera when I was about 13. She told me I could use 3 sheets of the film, and I shot pictures of my model cars in my bedroom, and then that was it. She said this stuff is expensive, so I didn't shoot another picture. I was at Southwest Junior College as a freshman when my roommate brought a camera. He was a journalism major. Steve Gardner brought a camera to the dorm room, and he was generous with it and said, take it anytime you want. And that's where I fell in love with the camera. And we discovered the dark room and discovered that we could tell stories, and people would pay attention if we did our job well.
Well, Ted, you did your job well today telling Jackie Wallace's story. I encourage everybody to get out to Summit, Mississippi this weekend or pick up the book in their local bookstore and stick with us. We've got more good things.